Let's move the clock back 83 years. 83 years. Today is Saturday, January 2nd, 1943. We're 18 years old. We're finishing up Christmas break, and soon we'll be cruising into our last semester of high school. It's Saturday, and I've got a date. And I asked my dad if I can borrow the car. And Dad said, you know, they just started rationing gas last month. Why would they be rationing gas? We're at war, all right? And we're trying to stretch our resources. Dad said, they just started rationing gas. I don't want you hot rodding, but where are you going? And I said, Dad, I got a date. I'm taking my date. We're going to go down to the river and we're going to watch the submarine races. Everyone knows there's no submarines on the Illinois River. Watching the submarine races, that's really a code word for what? We're gonna go down there, maybe cuddling, maybe smooching, maybe having an adult beverage or two. All right. And Dad realizing that we only got a semester to go in high school. When we're walking down that aisle, that stage to pick up our diploma, chances are really good that within a week or two, we're going to get a letter in the mail. And what's that letter going to be about? It's going to be our draft notice. So Dad realizes we don't have much longer to be teenagers. And Dad says, okay, go ahead. But remember, no hot rodding. That tank of gas has to last me a long time. So I pick up my date. We go down to the river. All right. And it's cold. And before you know it, the windows are fogged up. And there's a rapping on the window. Not a tapping like through a gloved hand, but like a metallic rapping sound. And I roll down the window and there's a guard, a guy in uniform with a gun, saying, "What are you doing here?" Well, we're talking. Well, he said, "You go talk somewhere else. Get out of here." And we wipe the windows clean, drive away, and as we cross the river, we see that. What is that? Where did it come from? And where is it going? And that's what we're going to talk about for about the next hour. Before we begin, are there any veterans with us today? I got a veteran. Veteran, all right. So Navy, any other Navy? Army? Marine? Air Force, okay. Very nice. I gave this talk at McKinley School in Ottawa the day after Memorial Day. I've got about 100 fourth graders all around me on the gymnasium floor. And I left this slide in there thinking maybe the principal, maybe one of the teachers was a veteran. I was the only veteran there. And I asked the kids, what do you say to a veteran? And the kids, with a lot of little hands went up, said, yes. They go, well, thank you for your service. I said, and the veterans really appreciate when you say that. But I said, yesterday on Memorial Day, my group of submarine veterans and I were at Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery, and we were helping at their program, giving out programs. And I remember one of the workers from the cemetery helping an older veteran to his chair. And he didn't say, thank you for your service. He said, welcome home. Because for many veterans, they didn't feel welcome when they came home. So boys and girls, it's up to you. Please, by all means, continue saying thank you for your service, but please add welcome home. And after my presentation, many of them came up and said welcome home. I also need to include this slide just to remind folks of the VA's top priority, all right, helping veterans in crisis. And quite often, all it takes is listening, just listening. There's training you can take called SAVE training through the VA, all right? But I've heard many stories where someone was having a bad day. It didn't take much where they were going to do something bad. And all it took was a heart-to-heart conversation from someone that listened, someone that said, how you doing? You want to join us for lunch today at school? You know, what are you doing this afternoon? What are you doing after school? All it took was that simple conversation that changed the whole complexion of what that individual maybe had planned to do that day. Something bad to something good. Ever see a submarine on the Illinois River? That gentleman that was just here told me as a child, his dad took him to the river to see a submarine coming down the river. I've met about 10 folks, I guess 11 now, all right, who have seen submarines coming down the river. I gave this talk at the Veterans Home and I met Larry Wilson, an engineman on a diesel submarine. He's in his 90s now, but he remembers as a child in Lakin, Illinois, playing on the river with his friends, and a submarine was coming down the river. And there were guards with guns that scared the heck out of the kids to the point where one of the kids soiled his pants. But perhaps you or your family, you know, you're going through those cigar boxes, those shoe boxes of pictures, and you may see a picture of a submarine. You didn't know what it was. If you don't mind sharing it, please send it my way. My ham radio call sign, kb9ezz@yahoo.com. I'm Joe Tokarz. I am a submarine veteran. I'm a life member of the American Legion, of the Disabled American Veterans, and also of the United States Submarine Veterans Incorporated. I volunteer at the U-505 in Chicago at the Museum of Science and Industry. That's a Type 9C German submarine, a German submarine right here in Chicago that you can go visit. It was captured June 4th of 1944. What happened on June 6th of 44? D-Day, all right? Captain Gallery, who's from Chicago, he was the head of the task force that captured the U-505. He got in trouble with his boss. What are you doing capturing a German submarine 2 days before D-Day? That D is going to stand for disaster. But as it happened, they removed 900 pounds of intelligence, not one, but two of the 4 rotor Enigma code machines, and all the keys for those machines, along with an acoustic torpedo that we were able to develop countermeasures for. But the capture of the U-505 helped ensure the success of D-Day. I love volunteering there. If you have the opportunity, please volunteer. All right. You meet people from around the world. And I want to tell you about a family I met from Romania. I'm at the museum and I hear this mom and dad and their daughter talking, beautiful accent. And I asked, where are you from? And they said, we're from Romania. I said, well, welcome to Chicago. And I looked down at their daughter and I'm sorry. I asked the mom and dad, how old were you when communism fell in Romania? And they said, well, we were about as old as our daughter. We were about 10. I said, oh, that's amazing. And I asked her daughter, I said, you know, between the age of 20 and 23, I lived over a year off the face of the earth. I lived over a year underwater, on and off, 100 days on, 100 days off, but over that 3-year period, over a year. Why would I do something as crazy as that? And she said, I don't know. And I said, because when I was just a little bit younger than you, we had a president who inspired me. He said, ask not what your country can do for you. And before I can finish those words of John Kennedy, her mom and dad, who were 10 when communism fell in Romania, answered, ask what you can do for your country. I started asking American kids the same question. And, not many could answer without having to use their phone. Something else I ask kids is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I would always give mom and dad an assignment. When you go home, visit this website and ask the kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? At the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Occupational Outlook Handbook, there are over 800 jobs listed that'll tell you what are the working conditions, how much school do you need, how much can you earn, how many jobs are there going to be in 10 years? And at the very last page of the little 3 or 4 page report would be a link to a society for that occupation. So someone might be 10 years old and they want to be a brain surgeon. Well, you can go to the Association of Brain Surgeons and say, I'm 10 years old. What do I have to do today to be a brain surgeon? Another power of that website is, this is a filter. And I simply chose, tell me all the jobs where you can earn over $100,000 a year with only a high school degree. And of over 800 jobs in the database, they only list 5. So boys and girls, it's a good idea to think about either college or maybe a trade school, all right, after high school. Something else I do at the museum, I take pictures of people through the observation navigation periscope of the U-505. And the gentleman that was here confirmed that because that lens is curved, there's going to be distortion. You can see mom has a cone head and dad has 2 mouths. And they're about 100 feet away from me where I'm taking their picture with the camera. And I yelled at them, get closer. And their young son tries to jam everybody's head together. All right, but dad doesn't get the message and mom's too far away. But you can see the crosshair of the periscope. I'm also trying to make the U-505 the new romantic destination of Chicago, with smooching in the scope. You know, you see him with his hand up. He's got a bright light shining on them because it's pretty dark down there. If you're going to come down to get a picture taken, make sure you bring a bright light. And I did bring maps or for the museum that's on the back table. You're welcome to take a map with you. And this just shows you the upper square in white. That's where you take the picture at. And then further below the X is where your subjects are sitting on the floor to get their picture taken. But the U-505, if you haven't been there in a long time, it's now underground. All right, the Chicago winters were very cruel, and they removed 3,000 pounds of corrosion, brought her inside, painted her up. She looks great. While I'm at the periscope, across from where I'm standing is the 4-rotor Enigma, the code machine. Germany thought no one's going to break this code. But they added an extra rotor for submarine, for communications to and from the submarines, all right, to make it super secret. I'm at the periscope, and there's this gentleman peering at the Enigma. And I go over and talk to him. I say, sir, I know all about the Enigma. I know how it works. Perhaps if you have any questions, I can answer them. And he turns around in a thick British accent, says to me, if I have any questions on the Enigma, perhaps he can answer them. He gave me his business card, and he was Dr. Mark Baldwin, also known as Dr. Enigma, one of the world's experts on the Enigma. And I said, Dr. Enigma, I try to explain to my guests as best as I can about the workings of the Enigma, but they always want more. And I direct them to the movie, The Imitation Game, about Alan Turing and his team at Bletchley Park that made the machine to break the Enigma code. How accurate is that movie? I asked Dr. Enigma. And he said, you know, Hollywood gives you a good story, may or may not be true or accurate. Imitation Game, probably less than 60% accurate. So I asked him, where do you go to learn more Or do I send my guests to learn more when they want to know more? And he recommends X, Y, and Z, the story of breaking the enigma. You notice X has the same coloring as the French flag. Why? The same coloring as the British flag. And what flag is red and white? Poland. After World War I, the Poles realized that it was only a matter of time before Germany was going to be a problem. So they started a cipher bureau. They hired mathematicians. They taught them how to break code. They bought an Enigma that was a commercial product, and they started reading the German messages. But as we got closer to World War II, Germany started fiddling with the Enigma, adding things, more rotors, changing the wiring of rotors. Excuse me. And the mathematicians, Germany took a rotor and rewired it. And the Poles, using nothing more than mathematics, figured out the new wiring. These guys were good. And I'm happy to report now there's a memorial at Bletchley Park honoring the Poles that really were the first to break the Enigma code and help taught the British and the French those skills. I'm a life member of the United States Submarine Veterans Incorporated. Our creed is honoring our fallen submarine heroes, all right, to perpetuate the memory of our shipmates who gave their lives in pursuit of their duties while serving their country. We meet, our chapters are called bases. The Chicago base meets the first Saturday of the month. I think for March, we're going to meet at the VFW in Joliet. But someone once told me you could be married 50 years and your wife would never understand you, but you go into a room of submarine veterans and you're home again. So, and this is the reason I'm here, is in World War II, 28 submarines were built in Wisconsin. They all passed LaSalle on their way to New Orleans to be completed. 25 submarines went to war. 4 of them and their crews never came home. So I'm here to honor their memories. I'm going to give you a condensed book report. You know, the book X, Y, and Z I told you about, and this book, Freshwater Submarines, the Manitowoc story, they're all available here at the LaSalle Library. You can get them here. But I'm going to give you a book report on freshwater submarines. It was written by the commanding officer of the 1st and 22nd submarine out of Manitowoc. And you're thinking, whoa, that must be quite an honor to be the first captain. Whoa, he must have really made a mistake to be made to come back to do it again. Well, it was a great honor. And 2, he did not make a mistake or being punished to come back to do the 22nd one. The Manitowoc submarines were known throughout the fleet as some of the best submarines made. And it was a great honor to come back. Matter of fact, during their normal sea duty rotation, many sailors volunteered to come back to Manitowoc to bring another boat down the river. And perhaps it was to see what their girlfriends are up to up in Manitowoc. The book introduces us to Charles West. He was born in Mendota, right here in LaSalle County. All right, he was president of the Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company. And it was a relationship of like a family between management and labor. He had some employees in their 80s and their families and their grandkids working there. And they were treated like a family. Even during the Depression, he looked for work to keep the shipbuilding company open so that everyone can bring food, put food on the table. There wasn't a lot of call for shipbuilding during the Depression. They were refurbishing locomotive cars. They were building cranes. Perhaps you would still see cranes, orange cranes that say Manitowoc on the back of them. Some of the strongest cranes that we have. But he could read the paper like everyone else. He knew that during the Depression, towards the end of the Depression, things in Europe weren't going very well. Maybe war was on the horizon. You know, after World War I, the United States believed that was the war to end all wars. There's going to be no more war. We don't need an army. We don't need Marines. We don't need the Navy. And they let our forces languish. There was a treaty between all the nations of how many vessels you can have, how many Navy vessels you can have. The United States was at the low end of our allotted numbers. So Mr. West, wanting to keep his employees engaged and working and putting the food on the table, started coming up with ideas. What can we build at the Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company that the Navy would need? And he thought, well, we build big ore boats, tugboats, fireboats. We could build destroyers. Now, what kind of questions would you have about building a destroyer in Wisconsin? How do you get it to the ocean, right? How do you get it to the ocean? And that was a problem that Mr. West was struggling with. We can build a destroyer here, but how would we get it to the ocean? We have the St. Lawrence River. Remember, the St. Lawrence Seaway wasn't constructed until the late 50s, and we're still talking about the 30s, all right? The St. Lawrence River, too shallow, locks weren't long enough, all right? Bridges were too low. Erie Canal, same thing. It wasn't built for destroyers. He didn't know. You know, he checked with his engineers and found that the most restrictive part of a trip from Lake Michigan down the Chicago River and Sanitary Canal, Des Plaines River, Illinois River, Mississippi, that would be 9 foot. He says, maybe we can go down that way. But how would we prevent something from needing maybe 20 foot of water, a draft, to get through something, excuse me, only 9 feet deep? So he put on his hat and coat, took a walk around the shipyard, talking to the employees, turned the corner, looking face to face with a floating dry dock. It's a vessel designed to sink. You drive a ship into it, you pump the water out, you lift it up. The ship is now out of the water, and you can paint it and fix it, do whatever you need. He goes, you know what? Maybe we can use a floating dry dock. So he had his draftsman draw the cutaway of a floating dry dock with a destroyer in it. Confirmed the worst case was 9 foot. Put on his hat and coat, grabbed the train, went to Washington, D.C., talked to an admiral. Said, Admiral, we'd like to build destroyers in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Admiral took one look at the drawings and says, that's a great idea. We'll get back to you. Mr. West comes back to Manitowoc, and he's back at the shipyard for just a little bit of time. He's summoned back to Washington, comes back to the admiral's office. He sees his drawing, and there's a destroyer in the floating dry dock, but there's a big circle around it. And he's thinking, uh-oh, I don't know what this is about. But he learns that Uncle wants his boats. Uncle Sam wants his submarines. The book introduced us to Mr. West. The book also introduces us to the pedo. What in the world is a pedo? Well, it's a fish. All right, that's a Spanish word for it. It's also called ono in Hawaiian, or or Wahoo in English. But the book doesn't talk about that kind of pedo. It talks about this one, the USS pedo. You know, normally when you see a ship being launched, it goes back in first. The Manitowoc River is too narrow for that. It's got to go sideways. First time ever. Submarines being launched side first. Navy was kind of concerned that the ship with the round bottom, once it hits the water, it's going to keep rolling and it's going to sink before she ever sits on the surface. But they had a great track record at the Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company. Built a lot of ships, a lot of big ships. And they want to build destroyers. But he's been summoned back to Washington. He tells them about their quality work, the great relationship between management and the workers. And he learns that the Navy needs submarines more so than destroyers. And Mr. West goes, "No, we can build tugboats, fireboats, ore boats, big boats, destroyers, but submarines, oh, that's too complex for us." And the Navy says, "Well, you know, we could introduce you to the good folks at Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut. They build submarines. They've been building submarines for a very long time, quality submarines. They have plans that work, tested plans. You could use their plans. You could work with them. All right. You could use well-established, proven plans." And West and his team, he brought his team out. They went to Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut, and they saw submarines in various stages of completion. But Mr. West and his team wanted to see a completed submarine. Now, they learned that there's one submarine getting ready to go off to war up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So they jumped on a train, went up to New Hampshire to see the sub. But first, I have to tell you a sad story about the USS Squalus, launched in 1938, and she sank in 1939. You know, submarines are propelled with a diesel engine. Diesel engines require a lot of air, and these engines aren't sitting on the deck, open to the atmosphere. They're inside the ship. So somehow they got to get huge quantities of air inside the ship to keep the diesel happy. That air comes through a 3-foot pipe from the outside. Now, you can't go underwater with that pipe open. That would be bad. So they have a big valve there called the induction valve. The main induction valve, a 3-foot valve. And the Squalus was off the coast of Portsmouth conducting trials. All the indications were that all those hull penetrations, all those valves were closed. She submerged, and the indication for the main induction valve was wrong. That valve was actually open. In the engine room, over the diesel, was like a Niagara Falls of water flowing into the engine room. And by the time they blew the ballast tanks, there was too much water in the engine room, and she sank, and 26 people died. Fortunately for Squalus, her sister ship was close by, heard the commotion, got help, and 40 hours, they rescued 32 crew members and a civilian. She was raised in 1939 and then decommissioned. They dried her out, fixed her up. Franklin Delano Roosevelt renamed her the USS Sailfish. And she was the first completed submarine that West and his crew went aboard. Imagine going through those compartments in a submarine, realizing that not long ago, people had died. West turned to his engineers and said, "Can we build submarines in Manitowoc, Wisconsin?" And they said, "If these guys can, so can we." But they were humbled by the loss. And they said, "We'll build submarines, but they're going to be stronger and safer." So West went back to Washington and said, "Yep, we'll build submarines for you." And they got 2 contracts for 28 subs. And they won lots of awards. And maybe, they had built ships for so long that they had the technique down of how to build a ship. Submarines were just another type of ship, and they just had to work out some bugs in their assembly line. But they were good. Their 28th submarine was completed nearly a month before the scheduled completion date of the 10th boat of the original contract. This is the USS Peto. They're lowering this section down, all right, and it's called laying the keel. This section was actually built inside that building, inside, where it's nice and warm, out of the elements. The very unique way of building it. It was mounted on a fixture that could rotate about the welder. So the welder could look down, making high quality welds as the section rotated about the welder. Keel was laid June 18th, 1941. What else happened in 1941? Say December of 41? Pearl Harbor. So we're building submarines even before we're in war. Remember, we were at the low end of that treaty. We had almost no Navy. And the writing was on the wall. Something was happening in Europe, maybe even in Asia. All right. We need to prepare. We need to build up our Navy, our military. So, yeah, the Peto, construction of the Peto began even before we went to war. December 7th, Pearl Harbor. Also on December 7th, yes, we lost a lot of ships and people in Pearl Harbor, but the first merchant vessel sank after we got into World War II. Was built in the Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company. What irony. So the Peto, that's the first of 16 sections. It was 14 feet long, 35 ton. Those cranes, there's a little symbol there. You can see it says Manitowoc on it. The back of the submarine says Manitowoc. One of the first orders for material after Pearl Harbor was for Manitowoc cranes to help clear the harbor. She was launched April 30th of 42, 6 weeks ahead of schedule. They did extensive modeling to make sure that submarine wouldn't sink before she ever sat on the surface. And they realized that perhaps they should not add the 252 one-ton batteries inside the ship until after she was floating in the water. And that's what they did. So the models really paid off. She went on sea trials November 6th. Could you imagine You were not part of building a submarine, but it's now your job to accept it. It's now your job to ride inside that submarine as she went to sea, as she dove. I'd be scared. I'd be scared. I would try to make sure that I owed everybody that built that submarine some money to make sure that, to help ensure I'd be coming back. But she passed her trials, her builder trials, her electric boat builder trials. And on November 10th, she dove the 300-foot test depth off of Sheboygan, Wisconsin, came back into port, and the Navy said, it's our turn to test her. November 15th, they took her out. November 16th, she proudly sails into Manitowoc Harbor with a broom handle tied to her periscope, signifying a clean sweep of all of her tests. November 21st, she's commissioned. The crew had their first meal on board. And let me tell you about that crew. Only a third of the crew had ever sailed on a submarine. Only the captain and the executive officer had ever qualified on that type of submarine. What's the big deal? Well, once she passes New Orleans and goes into the Gulf, she is now in an active war zone. And as of yet, she hadn't fired any torpedoes. Her only protective action was to have trained crew, trained lookouts, and a trained crew who could submerge the ship in less than a minute. But there's a lot of bad guys in the Gulf just waiting for her. In May, June, July, U-boats sank 94 ships. She had 4 weeks of training to try to mold that crew, get them together, get them working together as a team. She made her first dive, no problem. Second dive, piece of cake. Third dive, she's just about getting ready to get under the water. And they notice the indicator, the valve position indicator for that main induction valve indicates it's still open. Just like what happened on the Squalus. They blow ballast tanks, right? What's the first thing they think of? It's the crew, right? They messed up the valve lineup. They go through the valve lineup. Nope. The crew did everything they were supposed to do. They send a repair party up topside to climb inside the valve. And guess what? They realize that Lake Michigan is freshwater. There's no salt. It freezes. It's icy. And that's exactly what happened inside the main induction valve. It was frozen open. There are stories in the book of their topside watches getting relieved, coming down below and having to use a fire axe to get all the ice off of them. Yeah, ice was a problem in the winter on Lake Michigan. But they got the valve to work. They got it to close. They dove, and they waited on the bottom for a while in warmer water while the periscope and the anchor could thaw out. Something else they realized is with fresh water is the radioman was copying a message directed to the torpedo when they were on the surface. They dove, and he's still copying the message. And he asked his boss, I thought we were going to dive. And his boss goes, yeah, we're already on the bottom. In salt water, radio transmission stops. The salt water is very conductive. Radio signals don't go very far under salt water. But freshwater, they were able to copy radio messages even on the bottom. These little I'm not a cartoonist, But I found on the internet a briefing book that would be handed down from one captain to the next. They would leave Manitowoc and they would write down all the lessons learned that they learned during their trip. And then once they got to New Orleans, they would send that briefing book back for the next captain. All right, so it was like a living document. So these little cartoons are from that briefing book, which, by the way, was, I think, classified as at least confidential, if not secret. And there's a tugboat pushing the dry dock and the submarine, and it says, "Toot toot, you all." Another cartoon, there was no GPS in 1943, was no Loran, radio navigation. They had lights, and there weren't very many navigation lights on Lake Michigan. And the sailors realized that one navigates by knowing the location of taverns and recognizing beer signs. But it took 11 hours to get from Manitowoc to Chicago. They let the crew enjoy Christmas with their families, Christmas of 1942. Watch the kids open their presents, have a meal with the family. You had to be back on base at 3 p.m., 4 p.m., shoved off all lines, and they left Manitowoc for good. 11 hours later, got the Navy Pier in Chicago. They were worried. They were worried about Chicago. All right, you're in the Chicago River. And they were afraid someone's going to throw a hand grenade or something out of one of the tall buildings. All right, they were really afraid. So they wanted to do it early in the morning before there's a lot of traffic. 6 a.m., they entered the Chicago lock. At 5 p.m., 34 miles later, 51 miles later, they entered the floating dry dock in Lockport. So what's that body of water called between Lake Michigan and the Des Plaines River? It's called the Chicago Sanitary Canal. Yeah, they had to, and submarines, they trim, they get heavier or lighter based on how much extra water they bring on. So they made sure before they entered that lock in Chicago, they had enough clean water from Lake Michigan to get her, so she could get low enough to get under. There was one bridge that couldn't get raised because the last thing they wanted to do was bring in water. All the engines were shut off, all the cooling was shut off, because if not, they'd be bringing in all sorts of bad stuff that would just plug up the strainers and the filters. And those poor guys on a submarine. The submarine's constantly bringing in air, fresh air, and those tugboats burnt coal. So that's what the captain looked like before and after the trip. And it says, gas mask special issue for Piggery passages. At the Western Avenue, it was an 8-track railroad bridge. The sub had 2 inches to the bridge and 6 inches to the bottom of the sanitary canal. The book talks about the first time it goes, they're trying to figure out if they're properly trimmed. They send a guy topside to go aft to look at the numbers on the stern, and the ship was so well balanced that as he walks aft, the ship starts to tilt. And by the time he gets back to the hatch, he's up to his knees in Chicago Sanitary Canal water. And they decided they weren't going to do that anymore. They sent the tugboat around to look at the numbers. But eventually they fixed that bridge so it would lift. But, once they could lift it, they would only lift it on Mondays or Thursdays at 9 a.m. 8 railroad tracks. We're at war. Trains in and out of Chicago all the time. December 26th, She enters the floating dry dock. You don't see much here. You see something on the left, something on the right. You see a submarine in the middle. Doesn't look like anything special until you pump out the dry dock. Looks like fun. All right, a lot of sailors in Manitowoc volunteered to go on security detail to take this boat down to New Orleans. Most of the crew would go down by rail car. All right, only a few, maybe 14 or so, actually went with the sub because sailors being sailors, they thought, well, I like this idea. Different port every night, different taverns, different girls. I'll go. All right. You see any problems with this? The dry dock is 330 feet long, 64 feet wide, 20 feet above the water. And how deep below the water can it go? There's a quiz question. Not more than 9 foot, right? And to give them some margin, the dry dock was 7 foot below the water. All right. Some of the problems. Do you see any problems with this? Do you think this is easy? A piece of cake? Taking this down from Lockport to New Orleans? There was no picnic. The Lake Michigan's up here at about 540 feet above sea level. And we stair step down till we get down to the Gulf, which is at sea level. All right. So we're constantly going down. That's the purpose of the locks. They're like elevators. They're like boat elevators. So you go into the lock and your water level comes down and they're going to open the doors and you're going to go out. If there's any wind at all, when you're in that lock, you're protected. But as soon as your nose sticks out, especially being 20 feet up and 330, you're like a sail. You're like a sail. It's like a sailboat. That wind's going to blow you, and you're going to have no control. Let's go back a little bit. You see the windows on the tugboat. That's where the captain and the pilots hang out on the tugboat. And to see in front of them, they kind of got to look between the submarine and the wing wall of the dry dock. They don't really have a lot of visibility. So that was a big issue, was seeing where you're going. And of course, sailors didn't help either, because they wanted to get some fresh air and they'd hang out on the sail or the conning tower and get in the way. Finally, they'd have to say, hey, you sailors, go on the wing walls, or, we can't see where we're going. Got to Lockport at 10:05 on the 27th. Brandon Lock. Leaving the lock, and as soon as they stuck their nose out, the wind pushes them into the other bank of the Illinois River. They wind up in a cornfield. They get to the Dresden Lock, only to find out that the lower pool was in flood. It rained a lot. 10-foot flood. So they send another ship up ahead to the Morris Bridge. And it had a 45-foot, 6-inch test board on it, and it cracked at 40 feet. They realized, uh-oh, we're not going anywhere. And the captain of the tugboat says, does anybody have a map? And the submarine captain says, I got maps of all the oceans in the world, but I don't have a map of the Illinois River. And the tugboat captain goes, no, I know the river like the back of my hand. I need a road map. So I get an idea of where I can put it at so that we could wait for the water to come down. So about 7 p.m., they tie the dry dock up to a willow tree about a few miles east of Morris in Mr. Peacock's cornfield. Rumor had it that Mr. Peacock is charging admission for people to see the only cornfield in Illinois with a submarine in it. But also with all the rocking and rolling that was going on, you know, when the submarine went into the dry dock in Lockport, it's sitting on blocks of wood like a cradle and banging into the other bank all the time. They're worried the submarine's going to fall off those blocks. So they install additional support. Something that they started, the lessons learned was they were going to put these supports on as soon as she got into the dry dock in Lockport. This, I remember seeing a picture of the submarine tied up to the willow tree, and I contacted the good folks at the Morris, the Grundy County Historical Society. They have access to the newspaper, to ask them if they had pictures, and they didn't. But the only thing they had here was that the dry dock was built in Seneca. So besides building LSTs, even before building LSTs in Seneca, they built the dry dock for the submarines. We're now on January 2nd. We've been tied to that willow tree for a while. Those sailors are kind of upset. They thought it's going to be hitting a different bar, meeting different women every night, and here they are. They're stuck in a cornfield. The Morris Bridge, we needed 6 inches to clear it. So the Corps of Engineers closed the Dresden Dam and they opened the Marseilles Dam, sort of like pulling the plug out of the bathtub. And by 3 p.m., she cleared the bridge with less than a foot to spare. Got to Ottawa about 6 p.m. Actually, I looked at the Ottawa newspaper. You can go online and read the newspaper. You'll type in the word submarines and it'll try to find you all the hits. About 6:30 p.m., she passed Ottawa. And in the newspaper article, it said that people were restricted from going on bridges. Why? They were worried about hand grenades. They were worried about sabotage. And got to Peru, past LaSalle, Peru, excuse me, about 10 p.m. Are we there yet? On the 3rd, 11:30 p.m., she hits the Mississippi and she can go a lot faster now. Gets to New Orleans on the 7th. Took 13 days. Normally it took about 7 to 8 days. Not bad. Not bad for the first time out. The river was flooded, so she had to wait. Lessons learned, they ended up removing 2 feet from the Minnesota was the name of the tugboat pushing her. They took 2 feet off of her stack so that, as far as I know, she never got stuck again under a bridge. Talking about bridges, bridge keepers, bridge tenders, when they saw these 28 submarines coming their way, they would put on their life jackets and they would find a safe place on the bridge to be. Remember, this is like a sail. Wind can take it anywhere. I mean, the tugboats, those captains, those pilots, they earned their money, because especially when you're starting from a dead stop, like coming out of a lock, you don't have much maneuverability. The wind is going to take you where the wind wants you to go. Currents are the same way. The story in the book, the captain of the submarines talking to one of the pilots is about 2 o'clock in the morning. He goes, "I'm tired, I'm going to bed." And the captain goes out up on the submarine, down the ladder into a stateroom, and just about ready to get some shut eye, and boom, there's this huge commotion. He goes up the ladder and he cannot get out onto the top of the submarine because there's a tree blocking his way. There's branches and limbs and leaves. Finally, he makes his way out. He goes over to the pilot's house and says, "What happened?" And the guy said, "Oh, I missed a turn," and drove the dry dock 75 feet into a forest. All right. They had a lot of words to say about the Peru Bridge. The book talks about they kind of cursed the engineers who always seemed to put bridges at bends in the river. So it's, for the towboat pilots and captains, they earned their money. The Pedo, she made it. She made it. All right. Knock on wood, we were very, very, very fortunate that of the 28 subs, none of them, at least officially, were molested by the Germans in the Gulf. One of the guys on my submarine grew up in New Orleans and told me a story of a German U-boat captain coming to his class and telling them that he actually drove his U-boat up the Mississippi River, almost to New Orleans, but for reconnaissance only. We were very fortunate that he didn't start shooting things, because what we were building are the Higgins boats down there, the subs were down there, tankers could have created havoc. Anyway, the Pedo, her first war patrol was in Brisbane, Australia. She made it from the Canal Zone to Australia on 1 tank of gas. Did 10 war patrols, sunk 7 ships, earned 8 battle stars, and finally she was stricken from the register. But my information, wisconsinmaritime.org. Great source of information for these boats. This is a picture of one side of the memorial we're going to put up in Ottawa of the 28 subs. You notice 4 of them have asterisks next to them. What do the asterisks represent? They never came home. They were lost during the war. Let's talk about those. Oh, by the way, I've got to tell you, right? In World War II, Germany lost over 700 subs. Japan, over 200. Italy, over 100. The United States, we lost 52. 52. 4 of them from Manitowoc. The USS Robalo, key was laid in 42, launched in 43, lost 77. She was discovered. Thank goodness there's a billionaire, there's a group that their mission is to try to find the missing 52. And she's a North Dakota lost boat. The submarine veterans of World War II assigned a submarine to each of the 50 states, with 2 going to California, 2 going to New York. And the submarine veterans of those states would cherish the memory of those lost on that month that ships were lost. So North Dakota cherishes the memory of the Robalo. The Galette, 43, crew of 84, lost near Japan, cherished by Louisiana. The keel was laid in 43, launched in 44, 87, lost between Okinawa and Midway. Delaware cherishes her memory. And the Legardo, crew of 85, a submarine that passed LaSalle, lost in World War II, found off the coast of Thailand. That's amazing. In 225 feet of water, what else was lost with the Legardo? If you look up Legardo on YouTube, you can come to a 1-hour documentary about the Legardo. She's a Wisconsin lost boat. The museums up in Wisconsin, they cherish the memory of the Legardo. They have this documentary. And in it, you learn about the crew, about the captain, about their girlfriends. You see them writing a letter home, and their letterhead is that emblem made by the Walt Disney Company. But you also learn that the captain loved his Harley Davidson motorcycle. Before he would go to sea, him and a machinist mate would take apart the Harley and bring it on board. And then they'd come back from sea, they put it together, and he'd go for a ride. So off the coast of Thailand is a sunken American submarine with 85 sailors aboard and one Harley Davidson motorcycle. The Illinois lost boat is the S-44 or USS S-44 SS-155, and she was lost in that area where Japan comes very close to Russia. I told you there's a Lost 52 project. Thank goodness. They're trying to find the lost submarines from World War II. And I wish them luck.
The Illinois Memorial is in Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery, just south of Joliet.
Yeah, and back to the big flag at the cemetery is a memorial for our lost boat. I've been showing you pictures of the Manitowoc Submarine Memorial. Let me tell you a little bit more about how that started. At the April 2010 Submarine Birthday Ball in Manitowoc, two of the senior enlisted guys from the USS Cobia, the submarine that's up there, they're called Chief of the Boats or Cobbs. Two of the former Cobbs challenged the newer subsailors to help people to do something to help remember Pearl Harbor. So the crash dive base, the group of submarine veterans there, along with ours, the USS Chicago base, got together and we put up a memorial on the Chicago Riverwalk. Very nice, very nice. All right, that's where the submarines went past. All 28 submarines went past that spot. And for us, we had a little bit of money left over, and we did a little bit more fundraising, and we put another memorial up in, Morris, and another one in Joliet. If you almost across the street from the Rialto Theater. The one in Morris is at the canal port by the I&M Canal. And this is the location of where we're going to be putting one up later this year in Ottawa. And I just can't wait to sit on that bench with a cup of coffee in the morning and imagine, you're looking at the Fox River, you're looking at the Illinois River, and just imagining January 2nd, 1943, that first submarine, the Peto, coming past. Talks about the submarines that came down. And now you're all excited, right? You want to go visit a submarine. And I can't blame you. I can't blame you one bit. The U-505, we already talked about that. I've got flyers in the back of the map of the museum if you want to go. If you got room for one more, take me with you. All right, I'll pay for parking. But I have all this just to kind of give you an idea of the differences between one of their modern submarines and ours. They say they can have 48 on board. I think the U-505 had 57 when she was captured. USS Peto, a little bit longer, a little bit wider. She can't go as far. She can't go as deep as the U-505. And you can't go on the Peto anymore. You may have shaved with her this morning. She was scrapped. USS Cod, if you like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, just across the street is a USS Cod, and she is in pristine condition. But she's not like the U-505, so there's not a big hole in her side you can walk through. With the Cod, you got to get on board the old-fashioned way. You got to go down the ladder. All right. USS Cobia. She's another Gato-class submarine, just like the Peto, but they were built at Electric Boat. She's in Manitowoc. You can actually go up there and have an overnight on the cobia.
Currently in dry dock for.
Oh, she's back. She's back
she's
now.
back?
Yeah, she's back. Yeah, $1.5 million remake. And then the hardhead, I put that on. She's a Blau class, one of the later classes they built in Manitowoc. And we talked briefly, cobia. Cobia's just went through a $1.5 million restoration. It takes so many thousands of dollars a year just for upkeep. So they're always interested to see if somebody wants to sleep over and help with the cobia preservation fund. That was the Illinois Valley in World War II. What about the Illinois Valley or the area during the Cold War? And I found this, if you go down Illinois 23, down to Streeter, keep going south until you get to Illinois 17, head west, go a couple miles from the Ancona Bridge, and look to the north. You'll see that top picture of a cornfield and some type of mysterious thing that's about 50 foot in the air. That used to be a radar dome where people would come from around the country to Streeter to learn how to maintain the distant early warning line, a line of radar stations along the Arctic Circle. That school was in from 1952 to 1975. One of the weaknesses of the DEW line was it needed diesel engines to make power. It needed fuel. So the Army spent a lot of time just bringing fuel to each of those stations. And they came up with an idea of building a nuclear power plant for that. I put this in here because one of my jobs at the nuclear plant is I was like a history teacher. I ran their lessons learned program. We talked about lessons learned several times tonight. All right. My job as a history teacher at the nuclear plant was to help prevent us from making the same mistakes that happened at other plants. That reactor they built in Idaho for the radar stations in 1961, 2 soldiers and a sailor died during an accident. And we learned from that accident, just about every operator would be able to tell you about what happened at SL1 and why it can't happen at their reactor now. But on the memorial, it just states the accident reinforced a commitment to safety, which became entrenched in the nuclear industry. And this commitment to continuous improvement and excellence is now the expectation at every nuclear facility. Since we have a nuclear power plant in our backyard, I wanted to add that. And that's a picture of me saluting at the memorial. I'm going to sit down. Questions?